On a cold morning in a quiet town near Lake Avalon, David Carter, a firefighter known more for his silence than his heroics, stepped out of his old pickup truck for an extra shift. Bills had been piling up. Rent was overdue. His father's medical debt still haunted his mailbox. He had no choice but to keep working, even if it meant no days off and tired bones that barely healed from past rescues. But this morning, he had no idea that the frozen lake would change everything. The call came in just after sunrise. A child had fallen through the ice. David's instincts kicked in before the details finished crackling through the radio. He drove straight to the lake, passing morning joggers, blinking lights, and people too shocked to move. When he reached the scene, a small crowd had already gathered, their breath fogging in the sharp winter air. A woman's scream cut through the noise, filled with pure panic. It came from a tall, elegant figure near the lake's edge, her heels half buried in snow. Her eyes were locked on a dark patch in the frozen surface, where a small hand flailed above the water. David didn't wait. His boots hit the ice, crunching as he spread his weight carefully, remembering every rule from his 12 years on the job. But the ice was thin. 30 yards out, the child struggled to stay above the freezing water. David saw the red scarf, saw the fear in the boy's eyes. Every second mattered. His chest burned with cold as he slid closer on his stomach, crawling inch by inch. The ice groaned beneath him like a warning. He ignored it. All that mattered was the child. When he reached the boy, the cold hit like a slap. His uniform soaked immediately. The water dragged at his muscles as he grabbed the child by the coat and pulled with all his strength. The ice cracked again, swallowing both of them for a terrifying moment. David fought the freezing grip, one hand pushing the child upward, the other reaching for something solid. Somehow, through pain and instinct, he got the boy onto the ice and dragged himself out. By the time they reached the shore, David could barely feel his limbs. His vision blurred. He handed the boy over to the waiting medics before collapsing in the snow. As his eyes closed, he caught a final glimpse of the woman, the boy's mother, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched her son. The last thing he saw was her mouth forming the word, "Thank you." When David woke in the hospital, the warmth felt foreign after the ice. His limbs were heavy. A nurse checked his vitals, told him he'd been out for nearly a day, that he was lucky. She smiled, then added, "You have visitors." Moments later, the door creaked open. The boy stepped in first, now dry and safe, holding a hand-drawn picture with stick figures and blue waves. "I made this for you," he said shyly. Behind him, his mother entered. She was taller than David expected, dressed in a soft coat that looked expensive but worn. Her eyes were tired, but kind. There was something familiar about her, something strong beneath the surface. When she thanked him, David only shook his head. He didn't feel like a hero. He had just done his job. But her name stayed in his mind after she left, Elena Monroe. Later, he saw it again in the headlines. She was a billionaire, a tech CEO, a widow who had disappeared from public life after her husband died in a plane crash 2 years ago. Now, her son almost lost his life, and David was at the center of it all. The news spread fast. Reporters called the station. The chief told him to rest, but David couldn't. Each hour in the hospital meant more debt. When he finally got home, the bills were waiting. So it was a hand-delivered envelope, an invitation to the Monroe Foundation Gala, with a note written in elegant handwriting. "You saved what matters most to me. Please come. Elena." David almost threw it away. He didn't belong at galas. His apartment was barely holding together. He didn't own a suit. But something about her eyes, how they softened when she looked at her son, how they didn't look past David like most rich people did, made him pause. The next day, a black car waited outside his building. He didn't remember agreeing to anything, but the driver smiled. "Ms. Monroe said you might need a ride." At the gala, the world sparkled too bright. The suits were too perfect. The music too polished. David felt like a fraud. But when Elena walked in with her son, the room quieted. She wore a simple navy dress. No diamonds, no statement necklace, just grace. She looked across the room and found him instantly. The speech that night wasn't about wealth or innovation. It was about bravery, about the people who run toward danger, about second chances. And when her son took the microphone to thank the firefighter who didn't know we were rich, just that I needed help, David realized something. He wasn't just there to be celebrated. He was part of something that mattered. As the gala ended, Elena came to him quietly. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held more emotion than the whole evening. Would you ever consider visiting sometime? For dinner? Marcus talks about you nonstop. David wanted to say no. It was easier to keep things simple, to stay in his own world. But he looked at her, then at Marcus, and something inside him cracked. A voice he hadn't heard in a long time, the one that believed maybe, just maybe, you didn't have to be alone forever, spoke up. He nodded. I like that. The next few days passed in a blur for David. Every time he opened his phone, there were new messages, new headlines. News outlets praised his bravery. Social media exploded with photos from the gala, showing him in the borrowed tuxedo, standing awkwardly beside Elena and Marcus. But behind the screens, his life hadn't changed. His apartment still had peeling paint. The heating barely worked. He still stretched every paycheck between groceries, gas, and hospital bills. Yet, something felt different now, like a door had quietly opened, when he wasn't sure he deserved to walk through. Elena kept her word. 2 days after the gala, her driver brought Marcus to the fire station, where David gave him a private tour. The boy listened with wide eyes as David explained how the hoses worked, what the alarms meant, and why firefighters kept their boots by their beds. Marcus asked 100 questions, and David answered each one with patience he didn't know he had. Watching the boy's excitement reminded him of his own childhood, of days spent with his father at the same station, dreaming of becoming just like him. When they finished the tour, Elena was waiting outside, leaning against the car. She was dressed down in jeans and a wool coat, but still looked like she stepped out of a magazine. Yet her smile was easy, real. She thanked David again, not like a billionaire, but like a mother who meant every word. The visits became more frequent. Sometimes it was dinner at Elena's mansion, where Marcus showed off his drawings and insisted David try the garlic bread. Other times it was at the station, where David helped Marcus with his school projects. Slowly, something began to form between them, not just friendship, but a quiet understanding. They were from different worlds, but both carried heavy losses. David saw the sadness in Elena's eyes when she talked about her late husband, and she saw the tiredness in him that came from years of working too hard, too long, without ever asking for help. One evening, after Marcus had gone to bed, David stayed behind to help Elena clean up. The kitchen, though larger than his entire apartment, felt strangely warm and lived in. He noticed the little things, the family photos tucked in between high-end appliances, the sticky notes with Marcus's chores, the slightly burned edges of a recipe Elena had clearly tried herself. It wasn't just a rich person's house. It was a home. As they cleaned together, their hands brushed over the silverware, and for a brief second, they looked at each other without words. It wasn't a grand moment, not dramatic or loud, but something shifted. After that night, David began to look forward to the time they spent together. He still worked long shifts and avoided the media attention, but Elena made space in her life for him without demanding anything in return. She asked about his day, listened when he spoke about his father, and never once made him feel small for the life he lived. Marcus treated him like he'd always been there, like a piece of their family that had just been missing until now. But not everyone saw it the same way. Rumors began to spread. The media called it a Cinderella story, while others questioned David's motives. Tabloids hinted at a gold-digger romance. Some of Elena's wealthy associates began whispering behind her back, wondering if she had lost her mind falling for a man who didn't even own a car less than 15 years old. At the fire station, jokes turned into gossip. David's locker was plastered with headlines and memes. Some were harmless. Others weren't. Still, David tried to ignore it all, focusing instead on what felt real. He and Elena never talked about what was happening between them in exact words, but their actions spoke louder. She brought him coffee on cold mornings. He helped fix the sink in her guest bathroom. They spent quiet nights watching movies, not saying much, just being near each other. And with Marcus, their bond only grew. The boy would sneak drawings into David's bag, pictures of the three of them standing under snowy trees or sitting by a fireplace. Once, David found a sketch of their hands all holding each other's, with the words, "My real family," written in crooked letters beneath it. Then came the invitation to a charity event hosted by Elena's foundation. It was meant to be small, but the guest list grew. The mayor would attend. So would donors, executives, and people who never walked anywhere without cameras. Elena asked him gently, leaving the choice up to him. David didn't want to go. He wasn't ready to be on display again. But when Marcus said he was presenting his latest art project, paintings about recovery and courage, David knew he had to be there. He wore the same tuxedo from the last event. Elena had quietly arranged for it to be tailored properly. When he arrived, the ballroom buzzed with quiet admiration. But David's eyes searched only for two people. When he saw them, Marcus in a tiny suit, holding a folder of artwork, and Elena in a deep green dress. Everything else faded away. During the event, Marcus stood on stage and told the story of his rescue, not with drama, but with truth. He spoke about fear and healing, about how art helped him feel safe again. He introduced David as the firefighter who taught me to be brave, even when you're scared. The room applauded, and David felt something in his chest loosen. Not pride, but something deeper. Belonging. After the speeches, as music played and conversations flowed, David stood by the balcony, watching the city lights. Elena joined him, her eyes reflecting the glow. For a moment, they didn't speak. Then she touched his arm, and it was all the answer he needed. Whatever this was between them, it was real. Later that night, over leftovers at his apartment, Elena said something that stayed with him. She looked around the small kitchen with its mismatched chairs and cracked counter, then said softly, "This place feels more real than any boardroom I've ever been in." David didn't know how to respond, so he just poured her more coffee. And when Marcus's art appeared again in the form of a new drawing, one where they were all skating on a frozen lake together, David felt the weight of the past begin to melt. Maybe, just maybe, this was more than a story the world would soon forget. Maybe this was the start of a life he never thought he could have. The first snowfall of the season came quietly, blanketing the city in a soft white layer that muted all noise and movement. David sat on his apartment couch, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching snowflakes drift past his window. Across from him, Marcus was building a snowflake ornament from string and glue while Elena scrolled through emails on her phone, her posture relaxed despite the whirlwind of news still circling their lives. The world outside still whispered about them, tabloid headlines, online gossip, curious glances in public, but inside these walls, everything felt calm. Their lives, once completely separate, had begun weaving together in ways that no media story could capture. It wasn't just about the rescue anymore. It was about everything that came after, every conversation, every quiet dinner, every shared worry, and every small, ordinary joy that didn't need explaining. Still, not everything was easy. There were arguments and silences. One evening, a disagreement about money nearly broke the fragile balance they had built. Elena had offered to help with David's debts, to repair the truck that had been sitting useless for months, but he refused, his voice sharper than he intended. It wasn't about pride, not really. It was about feeling worthy. David had spent his whole life standing on his own, scraping by, never asking anyone for anything. Taking help from someone like Elena, someone whose world ran on wealth and power, felt like giving up a part of himself. But she hadn't pushed. She only said she wanted to help because she cared, and then left him alone to sort through the walls he'd spent years building. That night, he sat in the dark with Marcus's latest drawing in his lap, 3 figures standing under a Christmas tree, surrounded by laughter and stars, and something shifted inside him. Maybe being strong didn't mean standing alone all the time. The next morning, David showed up at the Monroe mansion with a thermos of coffee and a quiet apology. Elena smiled when she opened the door, not with triumph, but with relief. They didn't speak much about it, but after that, the subject of us became easier to talk about. They began planning simple things together. What to do for Christmas, how to decorate Marcus's new room in the house they were considering moving into together, which weekends worked best for visiting David's fire station. Marcus had already claimed a corner of the crew lounge as his art zone, and David's colleagues had accepted the boy with open arms, even helping him build a model fire engine out of recycled parts. The sight of Marcus walking around the station like he belonged there made something warm settle in David's chest, a feeling he hadn't let himself hope for in years. Then, just when life seemed to be finding its rhythm, it nearly fell apart again. A fire broke out at one of Monroe Tech's laboratories, a place Marcus had been visiting for a school science project. When David heard the address come through the emergency radio, his blood ran cold. He didn't wait for orders. He suited up and raced to the scene, his mind consumed by fear. Smoke billowed from the upper floors. Crowds gathered. Elena was already there, her face pale, her voice trembling as she asked every firefighter the same question. "Is my son inside?" David didn't stop to explain. He went in. The building groaned under the weight of flames and heat, but he found Marcus with a group of children in a clean room, all too afraid to move. He led them out one by one, then went back when one of the staff collapsed from smoke inhalation. When he finally stumbled out with her in his arms, his uniform charred, he collapsed at Elena's feet. The hospital stay was short, but enough to shake them all. Marcus clung to him more than ever. Elena sat by his bedside without her usual armor, her fingers tracing his bruised hand like she needed to memorize its warmth. No reporters were allowed inside, no press releases given. This moment belonged to them, not the world. Later, back home, when David found himself sitting at their kitchen table surrounded by laughter, spilled pasta, and handmade snowflakes taped to every cabinet, he realized he no longer felt like a guest. This was his family now. Not because he saved a life, not because he was in love with a billionaire, but because they had chosen each other, day after day, through every storm and silence. Christmas arrived with more snow and fewer doubts. Marcus's list had only one big wish, a real Christmas like in the movies. So they gave it to him. They trimmed the tree together, blending old firefighter ornaments from David's past with shimmering ones from Elena's collection. They wore mismatched sweaters. The fire station hosted a holiday party where Marcus handed out homemade cookies. Elena, despite her polished reputation, sang off-key carols with the crew while David looked on, wondering how he ever got so lucky. On Christmas Eve, they stayed up late watching movies and telling stories. David shared memories of his father, and Elena spoke about the early days of her company, when she and her late husband had dreamed of changing the world. There were tears, but no pain, only gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. As the year ended, new beginnings filled the air. David's lease was up, and he didn't renew it. Instead, he started slowly moving into the new house they picked together. Not the mansion, but a home they found on the edge of the city, a place with a backyard, a sunroom for Marcus's art, and enough space for family dinners and quiet nights. It wasn't flashy, but it was perfect. They didn't talk about marriage or labels. They didn't need to. Their love was steady, growing stronger with every challenge, every shared laugh, every silent understanding. It wasn't about being rescued or saving someone. It was about choosing to stay, to try, to build something real from the pieces of broken pasts. On a crisp afternoon in early spring, they returned to Lake Avalon. The ice was gone now, replaced by calm water that shimmered under the sun. Marcus skipped rocks while David and Elena watched from a bench nearby. The lake, once a place of fear and cold, had become a symbol of everything they had overcome. It reminded them how one act of courage could change everything. As the wind rustled the trees, David reached for Elena's hand, and she held on tightly, her smile full of peace. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The lake knew their story. The boy they saved was now saving them in his own way, with every laugh, every painting, every moment of pure, honest love. And in that stillness, David finally let go of the weight he had carried for so long. He wasn't alone anymore. He never would be again.